Welcome to our fifth lesson with Lawson. I know today is an interesting day with it being election night. I know the election results are slowly starting to come in the past hour. So I thank you for taking time to be here instead of glued to the television, waiting with bated breath to see who wins. It is also because today is election night, where we choose those who will govern over us, that I chose tonight to speak about the sacrament of holy orders, the sacrament of the priesthood, the sacrament of governance of the church. I found it very fitting, and I also believe that this is one of the sacraments that, as a whole, people know the least about. Very few people have seen an ordination. Even less people have been ordained. And thus it is probably the rarest of the sacraments in the church. And thus I would like to start by sort of going over those 6 parts of the sacrament. First, we will go over the matter and the form. The matter for ordination is the laying on of hands. Similar to confirmation, the bishop lays his hands on top of the head of the one to be ordained. And then the words of the sacrament are specific to the order in which the person is receiving. This is a unique quality in the sacraments, that while it is one sacrament, there are 3 stages in it. We don't see that in any of the other sacraments. There's not multiple stages in the Eucharist or multiple stages in marriage, but there are multiple stages in holy orders, which we know as deacon, priest, and bishop. And thus, the words all have to do with the specific order the man is being ordained to. Now, with that, the recipient of holy orders is any baptized man. Now, we can talk about whether women can receive the minor orders, which we'll get into later. But for the major orders of deacon, priest, and bishop, it can only be men who are ordained to this, because they have to act in the person of Christ, which we will get into later. The question, though, does arise with the recipient of the sacrament, whether one has to be ordained in order. So does one have to be ordained a deacon before he is ordained a priest? Does one have to be ordained a priest before he is ordained a bishop? Or can one just be a lay person and immediately be ordained to bishop? This is sort of up to debate, though the practice in the modern church, for the sake of grace, would be to ordain them in order. Even in cases of emergency, someone would be immediately ordained a deacon and then a priest. And typically you're going to be ordained a priest before you're ordained a deacon, or ordained a bishop, sorry. And so while it is up to debate whether it has to be that way, it always is that way. Next, I want to talk about who is the minister of ordination. And if you have the handout, you'll see that I put bishop there, but with a little star next to it. Because just as we have ordinary and extraordinary ministers in the other sacraments, the ordinary minister of ordination is the bishop. That is who normally, under normal circumstances, is the one to ordain deacons, priests, and other bishops. There has been, though, some cases not in modern times, but in medieval times, of priests ordaining priests. It's a very special circumstance in which an abbot, a leader of monks, who is a priest and not a bishop, even if he wears all the regalia of a bishop, is not a bishop himself, in the Middle Ages was able to ordain priests for his religious order. And thus we could say that a priest would be an extraordinary minister of ordination by analogy, if given the right permissions and the right circumstances. Again, never happens really today, but did happen, which gets us into an interesting part of the difference between a priest and a bishop, which we will talk about later. Finally, when we're talking about the parts of ordination, I want to talk about the graces received. The permanent grace that is received at ordination is an indelible mark specific to the order. So just as we receive an indelible mark, a mark that cannot be removed on our soul at baptism and confirmation, the same is true for ordination. And it is a mark that ties that person to the image of Christ. For the deacon, it is to the image of Christ the servant. For the priest, it is to Christ the priest. And to the bishop as Christ the high priest. So each order gets its own indelible mark. And thus, as an ordained priest, I have 4 indelible marks on my soul: the mark of baptism, the mark of confirmation, the mark of the diaconate, and the mark of priesthood. And thus I have been marked as Christ the servant and Christ the priest. But then we can talk about the actual graces that the recipient can receive if they are disposed to them, which is the graces that allow them to act upon that mark as another Christ, an alter Christus, to be able to be Christ to his people. The priest or the deacon or the bishop receive these graces through their ordination to be a representative of Christ. Of course, they have to be open to this. And we have seen many priests, even here in the United States, who have not been open to this grace and have failed at representing Christ to his people in horrible ways. But the priesthood, of course, does not just start with Christ. There are examples of priesthood abundant in the Old Testament. If you look at any of the patriarchs in the Old Testament, there is a sense in them of being a priest. Whether it is Adam, whether it is Abraham, his son Isaac, or his son Jacob. We see this line of priestly people, those who are mediating on behalf of God's people to God throughout the Old Testament. The 2 major ones, though, become the model for the priesthood in the Catholic Church. The first is this one character that appears for just one chapter, the King Melchizedek. He is the King of Salem, or the King of Peace. That's what Salem means, which is why Jerusalem is called the City of Peace. But Melchizedek is a priestly king whom Abraham meets on his journeys, who offers sacrifice of bread and wine to the God of Abraham, and then sort of disappears. We do not hear any mention of him again until one of the Psalms, which just happens to mention you are a priest forever, a priest like Melchizedek, in line of Melchizedek of old. This sort of mysterious figure that from a Jewish perspective they could not explain, but then is brought back up again in St. Paul's letter to the Hebrews, and is solely identified as a figure of Christ. For it is Christ who is a priest forever. Christ who is the King of peace, the King of Salem, who makes an offering of bread and wine turned into his body and blood. This is why we can believe that when Jesus said that Abraham rejoiced in the day he saw him, it could be very well be that Jesus was not referring to a moment that he, as he was at that moment, appeared to Abraham, or that Abraham was in heaven rejoicing, seeing Jesus. But perhaps this Melchizedek figure in Genesis 14 was actually Christ. Many of the early church fathers attribute that to Christ. But then there is also another set of priests that is predominant through the Old Testament. And that is the tribe of Levi. As we know, Jacob had 12 different sons whom the 12 tribes of Israel were named. And 11 of the tribes were each given land. But the tribe of Levi was not given land, but instead entrusted with the divine worship and liturgies of the Jewish faith. And thus the other tribes were to take care of them and provide for them. This is all established in the time of Moses, where it is the sons of Aaron who specifically become the priests, while the rest of the tribe of Levi become the Levites. And then one priest is appointed high priest. First Aaron and then his sons going down the line. But even in the Old Testament priesthood, the temple priesthood, we see this delineation of three orders. You have the Levites, who are the caretakers of the temple. They are the ones that set everything up, the ones who clean up the temple, the ones who prepare the offerings, but do not do the offerings themselves. Excuse me. And then after the Levites come the priests, those direct sons of Aaron, who are the ones who offer sacrifice and represent God and his people. And then there is one priest chosen among them who becomes the reigning authority and becomes the high priest who governs the entire faith of the Jewish people. To be the high priest in ancient Israel would put you on equal standing with the king in governing the people. It would have been the high priest or the most recent prophet that would anoint kings. And thus the high priest had a special role in governing the people. And we see these three orders in the Old Testament reflected in our three orders of holy orders today. And while I said, yes, these are the major orders, there are in history some minor orders that were added as ministries in the church, which I'm going to touch on briefly. For the most part, these orders have been suppressed as they are no longer needed in the church. And for the most part, the ones that do exist are only given to seminarians as they're preparing for the major orders. Called and set aside by the bishop and given the order of lector. And thus they become the ordinary minister of the word versus the people of the parish who have not been initiated by the bishop would be extraordinary ministers of the word. Now, unless you have a seminarian assigned to you, most parishes are not going to have an installed lector there for the liturgy of the word. An acolyte serves a similar role in that they are the ordinary minister of serving at the altar and the ordinary extraordinary minister of distributing communion. If there is no priest or deacon, the next line down is acolyte. But again, no parishes typically have installed acolytes for these jobs unless they have a seminarian assigned to them who happens to have received that order. But these are minor orders, or as they're called today, ministries. And I would be ignoring the elephant in the room if I did not mention the ministry of deaconess at this point. It is up to a lot of debate and talk right now, especially as the end of the synod on synodality just finished, this talk of what a deaconess would be. And simply put, a deaconess was another ministry in the ancient church. That at this point, the purpose of the ministry does not exist anymore. And the purpose of the ministry was simply, back in the early days of the church, baptism would have been done under full immersion. It would have been done completely in the nude. And the anointing after baptism would be a full body anointing. And thus the church commissioned some respected women of the community to be the ones to do the anointing, because it would be very awkward as the priest doing the baptism for me to do that. Nowadays, we just simply anoint the head, and thus that ministry is no longer needed for the purpose it was established. Whether they bring it back under a new purpose or not, or a new name or not, is for the bishops to decide, not for me to decide. But the deaconesses were never the same as the male deacon. They had a different role, completely separate from what the deacon would do. That brings us to the three major orders, the three orders that we typically talk about when we're talking about holy orders. And it is only these three orders that are indeed sacraments. The other minor orders would be sacramentals. It would be like, renewing your wedding vows. It's not another sacrament, but there is grace that is given from it. But these specifically are sacraments. And they mirror the orders of the Old Testament. The deacon, like the Levites, is the minister to the altar. It is the deacon's job to prepare everything for the priest to do the sacrifice and to assist the priests in any way he can. That is the deacon's duty of service. Because of that, the deacon is also supposed to be the hands and feet of the bishop. And in the early church, it was the deacon who was in charge of the money for the poor. This is why we have the feast of St. Lawrence, why he was kept alive while the priest and bishop of Rome were killed, was because the emperor knew that he held the purse strings of the Diocese of Rome and wanted that wealth for himself. And thus he kept Lawrence alive and gave him a certain amount of time to produce the riches of the church. And then we all know what happens after that. Lawrence presents the emperor with all the poor and the widows and the orphans and says, "Behold the riches of the church." And the emperor did not find that as funny as I do, or as Lawrence did, and had him burned alive on a grill. Which, I have not found the source for this, but if you look at the deacon's garment, typically it has 2 lines going down the middle and 2 lines going across. And I have been told, you don't have to quote me on this because I have not found an actual source for this, but I have been told that is in remembrance of St. Lawrence, one of the patron saints of deacons. It is to represent the grill marks he received in his martyrdom. Again, I have heard that. I have yet to find a source for that, and I have looked. But just as the deacons represent the Levites and are a mirror to the Levites, the ministerial priesthood and the priesthood of the Old Testament are mirrors of each other. Just as it was the priests in the Old Testament that would offer sacrifices on behalf of the people and perform the liturgical rites for the people, it is the priest today that does the same for Christ's church. And then finally, there was a high priest who was in charge of all the priests in Jerusalem. And thus we have an overseer of the priests in each diocese, which is the bishop, the episcopus, the shepherd of the people. And thus he becomes sort of the main governor of the local church. And the priests and the deacons ultimately serve under his command. And that is why, as a priest and as a deacon, I promised obedience to Archbishop Rosansky. Did not promise obedience to Pope Francis necessarily, because he is not my direct bishop, but promised obedience to Archbishop Rosansky as the one who is truly the shepherd of all of the archdiocese and has just entrusted the care of St. Gabriel to Father Molini and to me. There is one other thing I want to mention here, is the difference between the common or baptismal priesthood that we all receive at baptism and the priesthood that we as ordained ministers have, the ministerial priesthood. Because while at your baptism you are baptized into Christ, priest, prophet, and king, there is a difference on how that priesthood is acted out. In order to understand that, we must understand what a priest is. First, a priest is a mediator between God and his people. And by that I mean a priest speaks to people on God's behalf and then offers their concerns and prayers to God on their behalf. We can look at Moses in the book of Exodus. The people would complain to him, and then he would go up to the mountain and tell God all the complaints. And God would answer one way or another, and Moses would come down and tell them the answer. It is a very rare occurrence for God to speak directly to his people. And thus a mediator is needed. For the baptismal priesthood, your ability to mediate is your ability to speak directly to God. That no longer do we have to have this long overarching back and forth, but because you are an adopted child of God, you may speak to him directly, and he may speak to you directly. And thus you are able to speak to him and mediate on other people's behalf. Which is why we can go to each other and say, hey, can you pray for this? Will you pray for this? It is why we are able to mediate on behalf of our country. That comes from your baptismal priesthood. A priest is also a sacrificer. It's a word I made up. Sacrificer. Someone who offers sacrifice on behalf of others. And as people who have been baptized in the priesthood of Christ, you are able to offer things up for the sake of others or for the sake of grace. And then finally, a priest is a counselor. A priest is an expert on the human condition, and thus is able to comfort people in their time of need, which we are all called to do, whether we are in the baptismal priesthood or the ministerial priesthood. In all of this, you are acting as many Christs through participating in his priesthood. The main difference between that and the ministerial priesthood, the priesthood of ordination, is that we act in the person of Christ, the head, the leader of a community, versus you who are equals amongst each other. And I do not say that in the sense that I am prideful and, I am so much better, and you lowly people who have to sit down in those pews while I sit on a marble throne that is very uncomfortable, by the way. Not many people know that. But in the sense that my job is more specific. My priesthood is more specific. And that I have been called to strengthen my baptismal priesthood in order to lead a community to sanctity. This is why holy orders is often called, along with marriage, the sacraments of service to the community, or service to communion. Because in marriage, the spouses work together to sanctify each other and their children and bring them to Jesus. The priest's duty is to sanctify the people entrusted to him and bring them to Jesus. And hopefully along the way sanctify himself as well. And thus, with this ministerial priesthood comes three duties or responsibilities of a priest that isn't necessarily true for those in the baptismal priesthood or the common priesthood. These three duties, or munera, as they're often referred to, which is just a fancy Latin word, the offices of a priest, the duties of a priest, are teaching, sanctifying, and governing. And a priest has a responsibility to do all three rightly for the sake of his people. This is why a few weeks ago, when I was preaching on Amendment 3, I started by saying I have a responsibility to teach the faith in this aspect. That I will be held accountable if I don't do it. Because through my ordination, I have been given this duty. And thus, what are these three munera, these three duties consist of? The first, teaching. This specific duty involves not necessarily the teaching of arithmetic or the teaching of music lessons, but teaching the truth with a capital T. Now, that can be varied in how that is done. Sometimes it can be done in the math classroom. I can say that as a math teacher. But oftentimes it means teaching people about the faith. What I'm doing right now is part of my teaching duty as a priest. But specifically, it is the truth with a capital T. I am to teach Christ. I am not to teach myself or my truth or my story unless it is at service to Christ. Never should teaching be about me, in the sense that the purpose of it is to make me a bigger personality, a bigger star. Which is why it's amazing, we do have some celebrity priests in the United States. But having met a few of them, I think of Father Mike Schmitz, probably the most celebrity priest in the United States right now. He has a great sense of humility. Where some of the, different speakers at Steubenvilles and youth conferences, they love their stardom, they might give into it a little bit. I was amazed at the humility of Father Mike Schmitz a couple years ago at Steubenville, where he did not give into the stardom and the fanaticism of his fans, but would, after he would speak, quietly slip away to pray in the chapel. His teaching was not for himself, but was to spread the truth. I could say the same thing, I haven't met him, but of Bishop Robert Barron, who again is not afraid of hurting his public image for the sake of the truth. That is the teaching office of the priesthood. The next is the sanctifying office, which I think is the office we think about the most as when we think about priests. Anytime something good happens or we want something to be sort of prayed over or given good luck, that's when we call Father and have him bless it. But I think we could go deeper into what this sanctifying office of a priest means. To sanctify something means to set it apart for service to God. And thus sometimes, and I haven't had this problem here, but in other places, when people ask me to bless absurd things, Father, I have this picture of my son, will you bless it? Father, I just got a new motorcycle, will you bless it? Sometimes I have to ask them, why do you want me to bless this? Well, when I travel, I want to be reminded of God's protection over me. Okay, good. We'll bless it then. Oh, well, because I think it's going to be a good luck on the road. Maybe not so much. Coming from a multicultural parish, a lot of times we had to be careful with this, as my pastor would tell me. Because blessed objects were sometimes seen as magical and would be used in different acts of voodoo and things like that. And thus we had to be careful about it. To sanctify something is to set it apart for God. And thus when you ask a priest to bless your rosary or bless an image or bless a statue, it is so that way you can be reminded that those things are dedicated to God and that you are dedicated to God. When we ask the priest to come and bless our homes when we move, it is to remind us that even our house is dedicated in a gift from God. I think we can have a deeper theology on what it means for a priest to bless something. It is also in the sense, and this is one of the graces of orders, that it has nothing to do necessarily with my holiness. But for instance, when I went and voted this morning, I could see a sense of peace and calm come on people who were there. because they saw a priest was there. Now, some people, I did see them cringe as I walked in my cassock, and even that is sanctifying, because it is again showing them that there is something beyond this life, that I myself, in a special way, am set aside for God. One of our spiritual directors at the seminary, who was a deacon, encouraged us, even when we're out shopping or going to the movies, to wear our clerics because of that. Now, whether I do that or not all the time, not necessarily all the time, but the mere presence and knowledge that there's a priest there can change people's lives. I know this from my few experiences even going on flights. The amount of times I've had great conversations with people and provided them healing, because I, who for no reason beyond that I was a priest, they didn't know me from Adam, was able to help them, to console them, to sanctify them back to belonging to God. And then finally, and I think most difficultly here in America, is the office of governance of holy orders. We as Americans do not like being told what we can and can't do, especially when it comes from an authority figure as old as the church. But to govern something is not to be a dictator over it. And if a priest is a dictator over his parish, he is not fulfilling his duty of governance over it, but is instead abusing it. Priests are called to be vicars, which is an old term that basically means to be a representative of someone who is truly in charge. This goes in multiple steps. For instance, while everyone calls me the associate pastor, my actual title is parochial vicar. What that means is that I am a representative of Father Molini, who is pastor of the parish. That all in all, while yes, I can make judgment calls, I should not think about what I would want or how I would want to do something, but how Father Molini would want it done. Because I am his vicar, his representative. And if I was to put my thoughts before his thoughts, I would not be a good representative. Similarly, Father Molini is a vicar for the bishop and doing his will here at St. Gabriel, which was entrusted to him to shepherd. And the bishops, in a sense, are vicars of Christ. Specifically, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, who is given the title, the Vicar of Christ. We are all simply caretakers in governance, never wanting to think out of our own will, but out of the church's will, out of the bishop's will, and out of Christ's will, what to do. To not be dictators over our people. I think of, just this weekend I was on retreat with the youth group, and the retreat house that we were staying in, they had a little chapel, but it was infested with ladybugs and wood wasps. And we had mass in there the first day, and the kids were freaking out the entire time. Because anytime one of those bugs would get near one of the girls, they'd jump up. At one point, a wasp flew in someone's hair, and it was the end of the world. And so that evening, one of the girls created a petition that read, "We, the people of the youth ministry, demand that Mass be celebrated in a different location tomorrow." And a whole bunch of people signed it. And I, in good spirit, joked with them and said, "This isn't a democracy. The church is a monarchy. And right now, I am the king." In reality, it's Christ the King. This is not up for vote or debate. It is ultimately my decision. Did the bugs bother me? No, not really. Would I have preferred to celebrate Mass in a beautiful church? Because I wasn't really bothered by the bugs. I was a Boy Scout. I deal with bugs all the time. Yeah. But ultimately, I could not let my desires win out, but God's desire. And so I prayed on it. That is what governing entails. I prayed on it and said, "Lord, you know what? If this is what's going to get them to pay better attention at Mass, if this is something that's going to bring them closer to your church and to you, who am I to stand in the way?" And thus, we held Mass in the living room of the retreat center, where there were no ladybugs or wasps. That is true governance. That is what it means to be a vicar. On the flip side of that, there has to be obedience. To know that I might not always have the right answers. I certainly don't, having been a priest for 5 months now, give or take. I look at someone like Monsignor Simon, who has been a priest twice as long as I've been alive. I certainly do not know everything. But there is an office of governance, which requires humility to know that I don't know everything and to ask for help. Which is why those couple weeks that Father Malini was gone, I would constantly ask Monsignor Simon or Bishop Rivatuso over at Ray Fields for advice. That is true governance. That is the office of governance in the ministerial priesthood. I want to close finally speaking about the holiness of priests. As I said at the beginning, especially here in the United States, we've become incredibly sensitive to the fact of the abuse crisis in the church. I myself was baptized by a priest who abused children. So I understand the worry that this brings into people's hearts. But the church dealt with this issue on the holiness of priests and whether the sacraments that they do are valid if they are sinners over 1,000 years ago. When there was, during one of the various persecutions of the church, there were multiple priests who began worshiping the Roman gods out of fear of death. And there was 2 camps. One that said anyone that was baptized by them or anything along those lines needed to be rebaptized because these priests were sinners, thus the sacraments they didn't count. And the other side that said the sacrament has nothing to do with the holiness of the minister, but has everything to do with the promises of God. While yes, having a holy priest in a parish is a boon for a parish, we should not fear the validity of our sacraments if a priest who is far less holy is assigned to us. Or in our past, there was a priest who did the unthinkable. Because ultimately, even those priests have been given the indelible mark of priesthood, and thus are able to perform the sacraments. Now, they might not be able to legally anymore, but they will be a priest forever, in the line of Melchizedek of old. Whether they are a priest in heaven or in hell can be up to debate. But a priest they will be, nevertheless. And so, dear brothers and sisters, as we wrap up this lesson with Lawson, with next week ending our series on the sacraments with reconciliation and anointing of the sick, and as we continue on with this election night, let us remember to pray for our country, to pray for our church, and to pray for our priests. I will end with just this little story. 2 or 3 summers ago, when I was doing my Camino de Santiago, after we had finished, we took a side trip to Avila, Spain, the place where Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross founded their religious orders. And it was at the original convent of St. Teresa that I spoke to a nun. They were all cloistered, so she could only talk to me through a screen. And I asked her, "Sister, please pray for me that I may become a holy priest for the people of God." And she responded very matter-of-factly, in a sense very much the spirit of St. Teresa of Avila. And she said, "You will become a holy priest, or you will die. I will not be able to become a holy priest without the prayers of the people of God." This is a truth I have known since my early days in seminary. That every day through the trials of performing my duties of teaching, sanctifying, and governing, it is the prayers of the people of God that support me and get me through my day. So please continue to pray for all priests, but especially us here assigned to St. Gabriel, that we may become holy priests or die trying.